Okay. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to those arriving now. Thanks for those that were here before yesterday and during the morning. It's been very nice today to share all together. And we're going to close our 2 days of workshop with these two final roundtables that we think are going to be a nice exercise also to share a bit of the discussions we have had with other people that maybe didn't participate before. We also have some people on Zoom, and we are expecting to make this session an engaging one and also receive questions from the people online. So we have two roundtables now to happen during the afternoon. The first one is going to start now. It's called Critical Perspectives on Anthropology and Degrowth. And the second one is called Reimagining Transitions Out of the Growth Paradigm. The first one is going to be chaired by David Lewis. We're very happy he accepted our petition to chair this session. Very nice to have you here. And I'm going to be chairing the second one. We have a coffee break in between, so do stick around. And we also have a reception afterwards, after the second roundtable. So definitely stick around for that, so we can have more of an informal conversation, hopefully. Yes, so we are going to start now. And I leave you with David Lewis that will be moderating this conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriela, and welcome everybody to this roundtable on critical perspectives on anthropology and degrowth. We've got three very exciting speakers this afternoon. We've got Ieva Snikersproge, hope I've said that right, yeah. Who's from University of Neuchâtel and is going to speak to us about anthropology and degrowth, deepening the dialogue. Then we have Dr. Ritu Verma from the Royal University of Bhutan, who is going to speak to us about anthropology and degrowth, well-being and decolonial alternatives. And then, last but not least, we have Pauline Hellermann, from Goldsmiths, and Pauline's going to talk to us about towards a regenerative anthropology. So all of these are papers focused on themes around the relationship between anthropology and degrowth and anthropological perspectives on this topic, as well as how I think the degrowth discussion also impacts upon the discipline of anthropology. So the format that we've come up with is perhaps a bit less experimental than you've been used to over the last couple of days. We're just going to have a 15-minute presentation. Then I'm going to ask for one burning question. And if there's a burning answer that's appropriate, we will just have a brief back and forth on that. But then we'll move on to the next presentation. So we'll do them each with just a brief question afterwards, and then we'll maximize the time at the end for a more detailed, in-depth discussion where people can then focus on particular papers or draw out themes, between them, which is what I hope we can do. So without any more discussion from me, let's move straight into our first presentation, Ieva.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I'm coming here with a lot of hesitation. I was wondering, what should I share? Especially since most of my PhD life, I was very hesitant when I had to present my work. I was always using quotation marks like this in the air, square quotes, to say I'm working on alternatives to capitalism, because there is no real alternative. I was interested in it, I don't know if it could be kind of be called that way. And I could never assume the fact that there is an object that I study that is always in this perpetual doubt, this perpetual between alternative and non-alternative, right? How do you conceptualize it? What is that as an object? And also today, I was thinking, should I maybe show the ethnographic data, the kind of things that I've been studying and why it has been so difficult to navigate between those two, or try to speak about these things more at an abstract level and bring degrowth and anthropology and how I think these questions relate. So I have made a choice for the abstract version. I hope you're going to bear with me and it's going to be clear and it's going to spark some debate afterwards. And also what I want to say, at least when I read initially the description of the workshop, for me it was clear what the relationship between degrowth and anthropology is. It's more than clear, because actually degrowth studies, that's a very normative perspective. So for instance, here I have like written down the definition given by Latouche and de Maria. It says, the degrowth project challenges the hegemonic economic growth and calls for democratically led redistributed downscaling of production and consumption in industrialized countries as a means to achieve environmental sustainability, social justice, and well-being. Whereas anthropology, although it tends to side with the marginalized and the underdogs, is a social science discipline, right? So for me, it was clear that if there is a relationship, it's all about how anthropology could be used for the degrowth project. At the end of this presentation, I'm not so sure if it's that much of a one-way distinction, or there's also something that anthropology could learn or take in some interesting, as an interesting challenge, degrowth invitation. So, in my eyes, anthropology is a deeply empirical discipline, possibly the most empirical because its signature method remains long-term fieldwork and immersive participant observation that permits to think in pre-categorical terms, questioning the dominance of Western conceptual categories for world making. And because of this, I can see at least 4 ways in which anthropology could be useful for degrowth studies. And each one of them provides new insights while also creating some blind spots. So the worst one is anthropology as a repository of alternative ways of world making and inhabiting the world. While early anthropologists have been self-critical about the possibility of becoming mere butterfly collectors, that is, writing down the diversity cultures before they disappear, today their accounts, and that of other non-professional anthropologists, are used to spark radical imagination. In Gus and Hage's words, anthropology provides alter critique. Its accounts of otherness haunt us, reminding us that other, more desirable worlds are possible. This, I reckon, is the most widely spread use. It's the most widely spread use of anthropological knowledge. In France, where I do field work among radical and less radical ecological activists, anthropological accounts of different human-nature relationships practiced by some tribes in Amazon River Basin are seen as useful for combating global warming and envisaging non-exploitative relationships with nature. While such an extreme example is rather the exception than the rule, the more general idea of alter critique, that is, the need for alternative role models that we could use to guide our action and create different societies, is widespread in degrowth studies and among some ecological economists. For example, when degrowth scholars claim that economic growth is an ideology, what they call growthism, they subscribe to the idea that it is enough to change the interpretive framework of economists and politicians to change our macroeconomic systems. Many alternative solutions are proposed, from the donut economics to conviviality and happiness indexes, but they often fail to ask why and how the economic system produces the ecological overshoots before it reaches the social floors. The use of anthropological knowledge as alter critique is powerful in that it sparks radical imagination and inspires action. But it risks of being too ideological or naive in terms of how changes come about. Moreover, ultimately, it fails to explain why Western societies remain so growth addicted. The second way in which anthropology could be used for degrowth studies is its numerous, incredibly detailed studies of how people think and make economic decisions in a variety of settings, not only in the global south among exotic tribes such as the Amazon River Basin that French ecologists like, because of Philip Descola, by the way, I didn't mention that, but also in very westernized settings. Anthropologists have spilled lots of ink disproving the economist assumption that human beings are not homo economicus motivated by self-interested individual calculation. Anthropologists have shown that rationality is embedded in cultural and social systems and has relative circumstantial flexibility. This body of work, though, seems to be in curious contradiction with the previous use of anthropological knowledge. If we have never been homo economicus and we find much selfless, pro-social, and economic behavior among Westerners, why modern economies remain exploitative for both humans and nature, and we must seek alternative models in remote locales. Nonetheless, detailed attention to different ways of reasoning is useful for degrowth studies because it can show how think not only housewives and consumers or modern peasants, but also central bankers, private equity investors, and lawyers. This can be useful for identifying where are the blocking points for transformative change. For example, I have observed that in France, one of the major obstacles to generalized acceptance of universal basic income scheme, a mechanism that is not only proposed as a means to decommodifying work, but also demanded by colleges doing immense amount of unpaid ecological labor, is a complex and profound attachment to hard work as a social value. Work is seen not only as a means of making a living, but also a means of self-realization and contribution to the society. And this general idea with various undertones spreads across the whole political spectrum. Moreover, although work is a social value and economic reality is undergoing complex and unequally shared changes, hard work, in the eyes of the majority of French, makes a dignified and respectable human being. Then there are two other bodies of anthropological knowledge that I think are less known, well, depends on which circles, obviously, and less utilized because largely confined to the subdiscipline of economic anthropology. The first one describes the nitty-gritty details of economic alternatives, such as the commons, or we could use also many other examples, like alternative currencies and cooperatives, etc. So the details like who participates, who is excluded, how decisions are made, how it reconfigures rights and duties, raising bigger questions about what is property and possession and how diverse can be such institutions. Usually these accounts are less promising than competing perspectives proposed by scholars who see patterns of commoning as an alternative to capitalism, because they often draw on other forms of domination and exclusion and pose complex questions around upscalability and replicability. Like feminist economists and sociologists, anthropologists have also been at the forefront of collecting unconventional economic and statistical data concerning economic practices overlooked by mainstream economists. Here we can think of, for instance, one example among many, of Stalin's 1968 paper on the original affluent society, where he shows that if affluence was measured in disposable free time, the original affluent society isn't a capital society, but the hunter-gatherers who spend only a minimal part of the day procuring food. The majority of their time goes to socially meaningful activities. Finally, so that's the fourth use. Far from being butterfly collectors, anthropologists have documented what happens when non-Western value systems get integrated into the global capital system, and how difficult, not to say impossible, it is to protect these social values from the pollution of Western values, calculative reason, and aggressive antisocial behavior. The interpretations of why that is the case has produced some controversy. Some think it is because international trade. Is that the 15 minutes?
Yes, no, they're at the 10, sorry.
Okay.
I turned the sound off.
So the interpretations of why that is the case have produced some controversy. Some think it is because international trade and all-purpose money gives the means for more entrepreneurial individuals to accumulate wealth and power, disturbing local equilibriums and encouraging competitive behavior that unsettles local value systems. Others argue that it's possible to undo more holistic cultures only through primitive accumulation and liberation of the labor force. Yet others warn against any grand economic narratives and invite to adopt more situated middle ground theory because calculative reason never becomes a single dominating logic. While the controversy remains unsettled, I think it is a body of literature that remains understudied and underutilized, although it could provide some useful insights to degrowth studies. And these stories might reveal a surprise or two. They do not speak only of power struggles and new enclosures, but also cases when these changes are wished for and embraced with enthusiasm, or on the contrary, when they're given the cold shoulder, but they still manage to find their way in through the back door by the way of pop culture, technology, changing legislation, life rhythms, or relative prices. Obviously, this division between these four different uses of anthropology for degrowth is very schematic, and good scholarship usually tries to tend to all four different aspects. But I think they do present a very curious contradiction. On the one hand, alternatives to the capitalist growth model and egoistic calculated behavior are everywhere. And yet this planet-destroying, inequality-creating, growth-addicted economic system remains the norm. The central question is why that is the case and how to imagine pathways to a post-growth economy. I think we should start by recognizing that waiving desirable alternatives is only a starting point, that we should not transform into wishful thinking. We cannot simply wish a pluriverse into the world. In fact, we already live in a pluriverse, but a pluriverse that does not manage to challenge the status quo. How to get the pluriverse out of its subaltern position? How to uphold our ethical ideals in the frenzy of everyday life? How to turn care work from a form of exploitation into a form of emancipation? Is that just a question of point of view or the bigger systematic framework in which care work is embedded? I think answering any of these questions requires theory building that stems from but goes beyond any specific field site. It is important for it to be empirical and grounded in a way that does not focus only on moralities, but also changing material conditions that are inseparable from these moralities. An exercise that necessarily requires a comparative and global perspective. Moreover, it is necessary to go beyond merely claiming that human beings are not egoistic homo economicus by nature, but do the effort of proposing an alternative theory that explains what conditions make people behave like homo economicus, and which open other ways for inhabiting the earth. In other words, to respond to that challenge thrown by degrowth studies and the fact that our planet is being destroyed under our very own eyes, though we have many ideas about how things could be different, anthropology must build nothing short of an anthropological theory of value, something that, despite some of the authors who like to quote, is still a work that needs to be done. I think I'm going to leave it here, not to get over the 15 minutes, but
no, you're a couple of minutes under.
I'm a couple of minutes under.
So if you would like a few more minutes to just.
Okay, so why do I think it's still work to be done? Usually when I hear anthropologists talking about anthropological theory of value, it is David Graeber that is evoked, but I think his work does not yet amount to an actual theory, because it is a theory that is trying to claim that prefigurative politics is what could change the world. It's not only hunter-gatherers that can inspire political action. The alternatives are already there. We should just put them forward, and that's what's going to change the world. I think it thrives in this worldview that I described as rather wishful thinking. And the alternative is obviously a more Marxian approaches than the labor theory of value, which gets also at times too deterministic and does not really take into consideration all the ecological questions. I think also ecology has thrown a new challenge in asking us to rethink how value is contributed, how nature and labor are interlinked things. I would like to end on this.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, and thanks for keeping to time. So we do have time for a burning question. I know that ups the ante a little bit, but there must be somebody who is immediately prompted into it. Alpa, go for it.
We love that. Thank you so much. I also agree with you wholeheartedly. But I guess I wanted to ask, why then reduce it to an anthropological theory of value? Like, why not go for something which is both about challenging values, but also about real structures of power that stop that prefigurative politics from becoming actual, you know, and from it not turning into a utopian dystopia. So why not go for an anthropological theory of praxis, one that is rooted in the alternative imaginations of the world and in wider kind of political economy considerations of what stopped that prefigurative politics from becoming real. So yeah, I just wanted to understand why you're sticking again with value. I was with you all along the way.
Well, that's a big question.
Okay, remember you have the choice of saving it up till later or answering it now.
I'm not going to have a short and sharp answer, so probably it's better to keep it for later. But we'll know.
Okay. That's a good decision, I think. Okay, so we're now on to our second presentation, Anthropology and Degrowth, Wellbeing and Decolonial Alternatives, at the cross-current of critical analysis and activist engagement. So Ritu, over to you, and I'll give you the 10-minute call and then.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few caveats. I'm just back from the field, and that would be 11 years of living and working in Bhutan, where I began working on gross national happiness as a development alternative, along with some other subject areas, and then moved to where, you know, GNH, its place in the world, and then comparing it in relation to degrowth, and then moving into a wider body of these well-being alternatives. And now the project is trying to bring conceptual order, if that's possible, make sense of this pluriverse. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So the paper I'm about to present, it's a work in progress, and it's a review paper on anthropology at the interface of degrowth. So let me just put that out there. Okay, so bear with me as I go through this. So the issues facing the world today seem to be bigger, graver, and more intense than any other time in human history. This is because they center on existential threats to our planet and all sentient beings who inhabit it. While the problems are stark and apparent in everyday lived realities in an unwell world, from the climate emergency to the looming food and water crisis, environmental degradation, prompting the surpassing of several planetary boundaries. So there was just an article, I think last week in Nature, that says that we've actually about to breach 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. You have also extreme widening socioeconomic inequalities to a substantially different geopolitical order that is giving rise to authoritarianism and elite capture. So, and there's a big long list of all these, you know, issues that are burning right now. So to add to this, several weeks ago, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, delivered its most stark synthesis report to date, stating that the climate time bomb is ticking and the world is running out of time to avoid catastrophic levels of global warming, right? So the question I'm trying to think through is, how did we end up here? And what can anthropology do to address these issues beyond deconstruction, critical analysis, and ethnographic documentation? The cost for anthropologists of not engaging in these issues leaves the addressing of these very same issues, not just to climate scientists, health professionals, and psychologists, but also to neoclassical economists, development experts, business moguls, and Silicon Valley tech CEOs who see these problems as opportunities from which to churn out even more profit, right? So carbon capture and all those industries come to mind. So the larger, more urgent question we need to ask is to avoid repeating colonial and extractive histories of the past, is what got us into this mess in the first place, and what can be done to get us out of it. I argue that the multiple overlapping crises we currently face are mere symptoms of a deeper, more noxious cause, gross domestic product, or GDP. And then, yes, and underlying that are geopolitics and histories of geopolitics. So most critically for anthropology are the challenges and the possibilities of activist agendas and the imperative for political engagement, which until now has been somewhat limited, has seen somewhat limited disciplinary engagement. So quickly, I wanna, and in the paper, I'm gonna go into this like more deeply. What are the fatal flaws in GDP? Let's just lay them out, okay? GDP is a singular, narrow, and overused conceptual formation. What it is, it's the monetary value of goods and services produced in a country based on a narrow definition of what is counted as being productive, okay? And so GDP per capita is the foundation on which the international financial institutions and multilateral development banks are based. It sets up a linear, unequal catching up model and foundational logic, one that divides the world according to Hicks, high income countries, mix, middle income countries, and LDCs, least developed countries. So the world's divided up and it's linear, right? So let's go back to GDP. It's like this one gigantic calculator. It's got this huge plus sign for market transactions, right? So you keep adding productive activities, but there's a minus sign that's missing. It's not there. So that way you can't subtract carbon emissions or environmental pollution or the loss of indigenous knowledge and cultures or anything like that, nor does it describe what is being produced. It externalizes environmental, social, and cultural costs. So when there's an oil spill, your GDP actually goes up because of the amount of money you spend to clean the mess up. So, but then what about, you know, the impact to the marine life or to livelihoods and everything else? It doesn't count any of those costs. It's founded on the idea of endless growth, which assumes Earth has finite resources that can be extracted, exploited, polluted, which has led us to the climate emergency. It doesn't count what is deemed as informal activities. So women's unpaid work, not included, whether it's unpaid household care work or whether it's community work or livelihood work, it doesn't count it. That's the unpaid work. It also excludes a diversity of alternatives, you know, which I'll go into in a minute or so. It doesn't account for income distribution either. So we've seen over time the widening socioeconomic activities where a small group of elites has been able to really capture and accumulate wealth to an extent that we haven't seen in a long time. Quickly, it's been criticized even by its own inventors. Simon Kuznets invented it and then turned around and said, hey, don't use my invention to measure the progress of nations. But here we are using exactly his invention. Okay, so the world economic system is predicated on it, and it continues to be the central driving concept and organizing force for how the economy is constructed, how the progress in development, what I explained a little bit earlier, the linear progress, and also for whenever there's elections, you know, usually the main thing is about growth, you know, what parties can do to elevate growth. There's lots and lots of critiques of growth over time from the north, but also from the south. So for instance, the fourth king of Bhutan himself, you know, he was asked in 1972 about GDP in Bhutan, and he said, hey, you know, we think gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product. And then you've got Nobel Prize winning, you know, economists, Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, who've also said, you know, GDP, there's limitations to this and we need to go beyond it. Thomas Piketty, who documents, you know, the widening socioeconomic inequalities in 2015. The UN Secretary General, the list goes on and on and on. And recently at the EU conference on moving beyond growth, you have Ursula von der Leyen, who says the growth model based on fossil fuels is simply obsolete, right? So you have this you know, growing body of people who are critiquing it. On the other hand, you have a pluriverse of degrowth, post-growth, and well-being alternatives, right? Pluriverse is a term that's been coined by Arturo Escobar. And in the global south or the majority world, you have all kinds of concepts. Ubuntu from South Africa, Buen Vivir, which we've discussed in this workshop from Bolivia and Ecuador, gross national happiness from Bhutan, but then you also have some notable examples from the north, such as the National Performance Framework from Scotland, Awatere from New Zealand, the Happy Planet Index, the Living Planet Index, donut economics, circular economy, sufficiency approach, green growth, green economy, the list goes on and on and on. And so I'm not going to go into this in detail, but what I'm arguing is that actually not all of them are actual alternatives. Some of them put in the word happiness, but actually they're still grounded in GDP metrics. So some of them are actually false alternatives, and we need to make sense. And so there's a spectrum that developed to try to locate which ones are actually still rooted in GDP, which ones are paralleling it or trying to complement it, and which ones actually really go beyond it, because we need to make sense of that. And then also in the paper, I talk about gross national happiness and the kind of barriers it's come up against, okay, in a very specific geopolitical context, right? Little country Bhutan wedged between geopolitical giant China and geopolitical giant India, both huge carbon emitting countries. And so trying to think through, oh my God, okay, I need to rush through this. So anthropological engagement with degrowth and post-growth. So what I'm arguing here is that, it tends to be, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of things that anthropology can bring to this conversation around post-growth. And of course, there's a lot of it's been spearheaded by economic anthropologists. You have Lisa Gezon and Susan Paulson, who put together the groundbreaking workshop, which led to the 2017 Journal of Political Ecology special issue on degrowth. A lot of incredible writing there. You have, anthropology of happiness and well-being that's out there. You have contributions from anthropologists from the South, but their voices tend to be a little muted within the degrowth conversation, which is a problem. You also have intersections with, development, which are really important to the degrowth conversation. Environmental anthropologists play, a really important role in deepening the conversation. And then, of course, you have also, the movements, like we've mentioned, David Graeber, Occupy Wall Street. And I'd say that, there are some really good examples of anthropologists who've been able to kind of navigate and live at the interface of academic anthropology and activist anthropology, Graeber, Jason Hickel, and other people as well. But now, okay, what I really want to talk about in the last few minutes is the challenges of activist anthropology and academic anthropology. So this workshop has been really great because we've been talking formally and informally about some of those challenges, right? So I've kind of grouped some of these challenges into various themes, and in the paper, there's tons and tons of possibilities. One of the challenges, though, is the idea of limited conceptualization. So this goes back to the idea that there's all these well-being alternatives, but they're just loose all over the world, all over the place, and we need to bring conceptual order so we know what we're talking about. And then I think there's limited experience sometimes and hesitation of entering into transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary spaces that has to do with fears or not having the knowledge. And even though urgent action is required, it also means learning new modes of writing, new modes of learning, which sometimes anthropology seems a little bit uncomfortable about. There's also issues, around feeling that it would dilute the discipline, fears of being outnumbered in bigger spaces where it's not just anthropologists. And then there's long-standing contestations, fears, and discomfort with an activist agenda. And, at the ASA panel, David pointed out that this is an old conversation, our discomfort with an activist agenda. But first, I'd like to point out it's different than every other time because of the urgency of climate change. And I think we discussed over the last few days, why this discomfort exists. and we talked about it's how our discipline is structured, the imperative to publish all the time, having peer-reviewed journals. So what time is left over to actually engage in activism, and is it valued in your performance evaluations, as academics? Then is it valued? We also discussed that, well, maybe, some anthropologists don't get involved in it because it's quiet solidarity. You don't deconstruct something, because when you deconstruct it, you kind of destroy it. So it's better not to deconstruct it, not to be critical, and just, kind of support it in the background. There's also some anthropologists, who feel, well, fatalism, hey, the world's going to come to an end, and I've heard that kind of argument too. Might as well just enjoy what time we've got left. And then there's people who actually have issues with degrowth, and we've heard it at this workshop, some of the not feeling quite convinced with the degrowth movement, including the fact that it doesn't take on board the voices of the majority world, of the global South, and that maybe this is a luxury debate, from the North. There's so much more disillusionment with academia, which means that, well, this is a fight that's really hard because, for instance, at SOAS, you had somebody whose pay was deducted because they were in an activist agenda, right, with the union, and they had £1,500 deducted from their pay. So there's actual real risks. And so I want to just end, because I'm running out of time here. It's the geopolitics, right? So GDP is the, not just the symptom, but the cause. But underneath GDP, there's a geopolitics, and it's a very strong one. And I think we have to learn from past movements, the feminist movements, and all the backlash and the backsliding that it faced over time, and also the Occupy Wall Street movement and all the backlash and the backsliding, and learn from those movements as we move forward with a degrowth and post-growth agenda. Because if we don't learn from those, we're going to hit the same barriers, and we're going to just be, repeating the same issues over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ritu. A lot to think about there. And you're absolutely right that it becomes problematic when old guys like me are always saying, that's not a new debate, that's a no.
No.
So, yeah, burning questions. Yes, please.
So I'm going to take your last sentence, and how can we learn from past movements if there is no memory? For instance, in this country, I come from Spain, and I've been living in the UK for 3 years and a half, and I can see that there is no memory about social struggles in the past, like for instance, all the mines in the north, when they were reivindicating their rights during Thatcher. This is all nobody remembers that, and now we see that with the strikes. I'm also an academic, so how can we learn if there is no memory?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that too, so I will come back around in the discussion. Thank you, though.
No, it's a really good question.
Yeah,
and I'm sure we can come back to it in detail. Okay, so this is really exciting. Let's go on to our third presentation. Yes. So, Pauline, yes, we're just need a moment to get the slide.
I did do a PowerPoint presentation. So. Oh, just realized I have a few.
Yeah.
Just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, no se ve como ya. Turn it off. So
yeah.
Gabriela, I have a few. I just realized I have a few animation where this thing comes in when you. I will tell you when. Okay. Okay. Great. So yeah. Thank you for inviting me to be on the roundtable. And so the paper I'm presenting is one that is co-authored by Peter Sotoris and Tobias Müller, who both can't be here just now, but we started actually, we even wrote most of it about a year ago, and then we never quite managed to really write it up. So this is a very nice opportunity to to talk about it and to revive it again. But it just came from the sort of basic question of what can anthropology, which is the big question for all of us, what can anthropology do in the face of the climate emergency and indeed the polycrisis that you outlined, biodiversity loss, spiraling inequality, rise of fascism, all these things together. And so, yeah, that was our aim. And we started talking about it first as emergency anthropology, but in the end we decided to go for regenerative anthropology, partly because we were inspired by in regenerative agriculture and also the sort of idea of regeneration in social movements like XR. But also we felt it was particularly appropriate for anthropology, maybe because it is really about drawing on what is already there, but sort of making it come alive and flourish. Yeah, so, and it's, in fact, my paper now is not so much about degrowth itself, but as a little nod to degrowth, if you could now click on it, just wanted to add this, oh yeah, oh, it's not, okay.
Sorry,
it doesn't matter very much.
Minimize this,
Yeah, so I just added this, the title page of Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, because of course this was published 50 years ago, and I decided to use it whenever I can for the whole of 2023 as a sort of little marker. So here it is. But I also really love using this particular cover or this particular edition because of the title page, because this is, as you probably all recognize, based on sort of visualization of Gramsci's idea, the new world is not yet born, but I also like to think of it as almost saying the new world is almost born. And so that's sort of what I like to think. This is sort of the moment we are at. And so what I wanted to talk about today is the role anthropology can play in making this happen. It's going to be very simple. The part A is just what anthropology already offers, and part B, what we can maybe do to change it. And I should say that a lot of what I'm saying has already, and I've been mentioning it in conversation, but so many, there's hardly anything new in here. Everyone has been, so many of the ideas that have been discussed and talked about are in here. But what I'm doing is a sort of attempt to order it or sort of map it and put it together. But then, of course, you two have also been doing, so in a way, it's quite interesting, though, thinking just to rescue my point of what I'm doing here, it's quite interesting to have 3 separate texts as well on how to do this. So I will start, the next. So the first thing that anthropology offers is, of course, just to kind of capture it all with, of course, David Graeber, just to mention him as well, possibilities that, of course, anthropology is all about other possibilities. I mean, that's sort of, we have a prime position in this, in imagining or knowing about other worlds or alternatives to modernity. And indeed, just to paraphrase Latour a little bit, we've never been completely modern. All of this is here, even in here and everywhere. So it's that's sort of there, and that's what we do, and that's our big contribution. So I feel that's already number one why anthropology is, I should say this, I forgot to say it really clearly, I want to say it now. I do think anthropology is really, for me, the discipline for this moment. I really do believe it. So I want to say that, I know you are all anthropologists, but I do think it, but it's just a matter of making it play its part. But and so, yeah, so what, and then there's sort of 3, just to mention really 3 very specific kind of ways, which are things that we already have. I mean, first of all, we have 150 years of anthropology behind us. I know sometimes we forget a lot, and indeed it's maybe sometimes also, but nevertheless, it can be a bit repetitive to say it's all been here before, but we do have 150 years. And yes, there are many problems with colonial, baggage and the ways this knowledge was generated. It's not problem-free in any way, but we have it. And there's so much there that we can use, or to use Elizabeth Povinelli's term, to mine anthropology. I do think it is possible. And so, yeah, just not forget that. And then related to that, we also do have, of course, as we do know, we've all now been through this for decades now, actually, but the big problem of decolonization and the kind of ways in which you talk about different knowledges in the world and who uses them in what way, all these debates are very much alive in anthropology, and we've been thinking about them, and it's gone. And I'm not saying we've solved these issues at all, but at least we have been thinking about it. And so I think in that respect as well, our sort of knowledge of indigenous knowledge politics could also play a really helpful role. I'm just mentioning 2 examples here. For example, permaculture. A lot of different people around the world always find permaculture really annoying because it is a lot of it is really oblivious to how many of these practices already existed in other parts of the world. That is a big problem. Then another problem is also then the sort of cultural appropriation, the sort of easy using of indigenous knowledge when you do it. I have this picture here on the right is an article I read recently about the sort of revival of canoe building in Seattle and a sort of Salish River or something. And it's really, and I was like, oh, this is great, canoes and transport. And then in the article it said, but no indigenous leaders were consulted or involved in this. And it's like, how can you possibly be like this sort of thing? So clearly there are many ways in which we can try and make the politics of this, or we can at least help. And at the same time, maybe, of course, continue thinking about the role of anthropology itself in it. And then lastly, just because this is what I happen to be working on, but I do think as a specific area, historical ecology, this sort of knowledge of past practices, but existing practices, and as they are in our landscapes, and existing conservation or indeed degrowth practices, which many of you do really great different research on, which we heard about yesterday. All of that is, of course, as Paula yesterday said, we can study it. You know, we can, all these existing practices that are here, we can do that. And so this is about degrowth, but also biodiversity conservation. So this is slightly cryptic here. I put this in here because there is also a lot of growing interest, of course, from other disciplines, including ecology. And in ecology, the sort of phrase to use for how humans actually have a positive impact on biodiversity is intermediate levels of disturbance, which I put in there because it's quite a technical term. But the idea is that actually all throughout the world, when you have people that have many systems which increase biodiversity and which work very well, and which also have lots of similarities. So the 2 pictures here, one is from hedge making in Kent, I think, or somewhere in England, and this one is, sorry, I took it from Alami, but it's a sort of Ethiopian sort of living fencing in Ethiopia. So just to say these examples, and I think by just sort of putting it all together and showing the similarities in North and South, actually there are many, also soil making, loads of things that are actually all pretty similar. That in itself also helps with dealing with some of the politics around all this. Then secondly, what anthropology offers is also not just knowing about other possibilities, we also can, of course, analyze and understand the system as it exists. I mean, what we study is culture and institutions and power. And all that is extremely crucial for, in all these sort of debates we have about, you know, system change and also individual action versus system. Of course, what really matters is actually the middle and all the things that link it. And that's exactly where we come in terms of understanding culture and institutions and indeed power. And that is really important in terms of climate delayism, like really understanding why things don't change, or why change is so slow, and the resistance in it. All of these things, I think, culture, I'm just going to say culture now. Culture is a really useful area to kind of understand all this. And indeed, I'm part of a wider network of social scientists working on climate abstraction, the CSSN, I think, but there are no anthropologists in it. I think I'm one of the few in it. And also then for understanding these sort of different ways of how systems think, it's also interesting, good for finding leverage points for system change. And then thirdly, what we do already offer is also, of course, a long tradition of different regional alliances and allegiances and different kinds of knowledges, and also a long-standing sort of commitment, I suppose, to social justice issues, which now really are so important in terms of climate justice. And I'm saying this because I've been spending a lot of time with climate activists here, and I was really struck that by the fact that, of course, most people here in the North, most activists in the North do not have these links actually, and certain conversations make me realize that the fact that I'm not bragging in any way whatsoever, but the fact that I have lived in Nigeria and I know Nigeria and I have many friends there, that gives me a totally different vantage point to think about and feel about Nigeria, and I can also, then you can help and you can build bridges and you can be allies and champions and all of us in different positions. I'm not just talking about white anthropologists here. Okay, 5 minutes. And then the last, so now moving on to how anthropology should change in order to kind of really play this role. So firstly, that we really, and this is something that was really interesting this morning, that really came out in all the little, when we did these questions, or sort of what questions should we do? How do we move from analysis and interpretation to thinking through changing practices? Like how do you really, how do you actually change practice? Like, don't just sort of think about what is culture, but then use that knowledge to think about how can we change it. So for example, car culture, stupid pictures here, but how can we move from this picture to this sort of thing? Like I've just, and then so that's, and because of course other people, psychology has all this stuff, and nudging is really popular at the moment, but there are many other ways to think about it. And I think again, anthropology could play a much bigger role in it, but we don't really talk about it as a sort of even within the discipline very much, or in certain ways, but we could talk about it more. And then of course, just to mention it, but we do also need to rethink our own practices and values in terms of being part of the neoliberal university, and also the kinds of values we have as academics, as researchers. And yes, we are of course very much trapped. I know this, with very little you can do sometimes, and the system is punishing and punitive for everyone who's in it, but you can still try and resist and sort of, you don't have to buy into so much all the things. And you can also, of course, you can also change your teaching and how you teach and what you kind of commit to students. So I'm at the moment trying to set up a new MA in anthropology, in regenerative anthropology in practice, which is all about taking it out and doing work experience and thinking through how anthropology can help in climate action. And then of course, I don't need to dwell on it, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot, but it's almost a deeper question of academic cosmopolitanism. Just to say that, of course, the carbon footprint of academics is actually really, really high, just because we are all, because of being academics, very cosmopolitan, and there's something there that we can sort of think about a little bit more. And yes, so Sean Sullivan wrote a good paper about this, reflecting on anthropology research and flying, and I'm also just part of an article with Aaron Thierry and Charlie Gardner and others on no research on a dead planet, to kind of think through some of these things. And then last, and this is, I hope I still have, okay, because this is really the point that I wanted to keep last, because it's really the main point I wanted to make, which is just to get out there, which is really, really important, because I think being in anthropology, you do forget, and how small the discipline is, and how almost no one else knows what it is. Like, even, I mean, it's really, and it's actually astonishing. Like if you find someone, most people ask like, what is it? And then you have to explain it, or they think it's physical anthropology. That is, honestly, that's 90% of the people I meet. And that is, why on earth are people so ignorant about it? So I really feel that's something that we really, really need to do. I'm actually just realized I preempted myself. I wanted to start by talking, as part of getting out there, is also, of course, and this is again only repeating, or in fact using a word I only learned yesterday. You mentioned, I really liked this expression, the help build the tapestry of alternatives, that you, and this is Emma, that was so great, your presentation yesterday about working with people who are already practicing different ways of living, or social movements and activists, and then also and then sort of building the tapestry and seeing our role. I think anthropology can contribute in exactly what you did, to build, to put together, and to connect. But then also, of course, being activists ourselves, like not just writing about, not just following, but also being actually getting involved. But I also feel we have a sort of tendency to always to go to that. And yes, studying social movements, it's all very well and good, but of course social movements are, anthropology is extremely marginal, degrowth is marginal, and social movements are really still actually numerically are not so big. So I think we also really need to think still about ways of engaging with other parts of the world as it is. And so I also think we should try to just try to get more into actual positions of power. I can't think of another word. So IPCC, no, anthropologists, policy, governments, all these sorts of positions, the UN, you know, the definitions of sustainable development goals, all these things, we should be there, and not just economists and other social scientists are there, but not anthropology, and we should try. And then this is really the main point that I wanted to make. We should change how we write and speak, and how we and where. And I think again, this is something that you were already talking about yesterday. Drop the jargon, don't, you know, this sort of internal, inward looking, and the sort of celebration of cleverness, and a sort of a cleverness that we only recognize as anthropologists as being very, very clever. And then you're like, this person is very, very clever because they have founded a new word. And there's no point in any of that at all, because it doesn't change anything. And I also just wanted to add, and it's the average reading age in the UK it's slightly shocking, but it's the average reading age is the expected reading age of 9. That's the average reading age. And so all government websites are aimed at 9-year-olds, or what 9-year-olds are expected to read. The Daily Mail and The Sun have a reading age of 7. So that's the sort of level that actually we should really think about and just get out there. And because anthropology itself is not that difficult, but we should do it. Oh, sorry, I forgot the King Charles. I put that on there because I found it quite funny, because of course he studied anthropology, and then to have an anthropologist on a throne and design his own ritual, I thought that I need to get that in there. That's why. But yeah, but then and try and write in different ways and get out there. So I'm just mentioning here as one small example, one blog I only managed one so far. It's because it's actually really hard. But I wrote one blog of the tragedy of the non-comments, that the real tragedy is not the comments, but the non-comments. And I just wrote it. I briefly submitted it to undisciplined environments, but they found it too undisciplined. They didn't like. And then I just wrote it exactly what I wanted to write for a non-academic audience. I also, I will say about it more later, but it was an extremely liberating and nice thing to just not care about all the sort of trappings. And yeah, of course. So also use social media, use hashtags, use slogans, I don't know, all the things that people do to get us out there more, and also visit schools, which is what Peter is doing right now, because that's why he's not here. So I wanted to end on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to have a round of applause for all the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for keeping to my rather authoritarian time schedule, but I think the payoff is that we've now got a real chunk of time to talk about this and to dig into some of the themes that you've raised. And I think there's been a whole range of cross-cutting themes across the 3 papers, from discussions about theory to discussions about discipline, and also about practice and the need to be active in the world. So we've already got a couple of questions. I think it should only be fair to ask for a burning question for you, so that we then can move on from that. So would anybody like to kick things off with a question for Pauline on the specifics of that presentation?
Don't worry if not. I mean, we could just...
Okay. So why don't we go back to the 2 questions that we've already got. So Alpa, I think you kicked us off with a question about power and institutions. Do you want to just briefly reframe that, and then we'll take it from there?
Yeah, no, it was like, I wanted to say that I really loved your presentation, and I completely agree. And I think it was also in Pauline's presentation too, that we're offering possibilities, alternatives, different kinds of values, but at the same time, we're also, it's not just about being figurative politics. We've got to also see how that can actually become really possible, and that involves kind of material struggle, engagement with wider structures of power, institutions, and so I guess I really wanted to ask you, why then do you come back to the anthropology of values? Why not think about praxis, which is something that is rooted both in different ideologies, different ways to think about the world, different possibilities, but at the same time is also rooted in an understanding of kind of, I guess, political economy, and tries to bring both together, kind of Gramscian sense. You were also working with Gramsci in your presentation, Pauline. So yeah, just offering kind of, I guess, a different way to think about your ending and what you made of that.
I think it is an open question, right? It's strategic choice. Maybe it's worth discussing what we would think would work the best. I guess my natural leaning was towards theory of value, because I do come more from the subdiscipline of economic anthropology. That is probably, so more the, yes, political economy, but political economy that is very, how to say, that sees value as something that is everywhere, that is omnipresent in some way. And also, I think to some extent it can be strategic, because I do think if there is one social science discipline today that is taken seriously and that is hegemonic and that is doing a lot of damage, it is economists. Yeah. And I feel anthropological theory of value could be like a counter response, or that sounds like more as a counter response than proposing a term that is less economic. But that's just one take. I think it's open for discussion what will work best. Because it's true, like there have been times when I thought praxis is a good way to approach the question. Now I've been reasoning more in terms of that. But I think it's open-ended work that still needs to be done at that.
Would anyone else like to jump in on this?
Sorry, I'm fine.
Right.
We can say something.
I didn't actually want to say anything. That's what I wanted to say. I will say something later, but just now I was thinking. Sorry.
On this.
Yeah.
Yeah. The world is multilateral institutions, the international financial institutions, World Bank, IMF, they're all dominated by economists, right? That's the theme I wanted to pick up. And in the United Nations, all the agencies of the United Nations, when they're social scientists, they're mostly economists. So yeah, there is a problem with that. And you know, during this workshop, we discussed a lot about, do you fight from the outside or do you fight from the inside? And anthropologists do sometimes go into these organizations to fight from the inside, but you quickly get marginalized because it's so GDP centric, it's so quantitative, and that's the hegemonic order. That's how it works. And when you get in there, it's very, very messy, right? And so it's nice to. I've kind of done both academic and applied. It's nice to come back to, well, I don't know if anybody ever called anthropologists this, but it's neat. You know, it's a lot less messier than it is out there. And but we discussed over the last few days, you know, this issue of the messiness and the purity of things, you know, that in order for me to do X, Y, and Z, I want to be on such a social media platform, but no, it's owned by so-and-so, so I don't want to engage there. So it's like, do I or don't I? You know, and so it's that there's a tension, the cost of doing something or not doing something. But it's a really messy world, is what I'm trying to say when you're in applied or activist. It's something just to think about, and what might actually make people stay in academia and not engage in activism.
Sorry, if I may now.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Gramsci, and then, but I thought it wasn't relevant, but maybe it is, because I did last year start to think, oh, maybe just if everyone knew Gramsci, then that would kind of maybe help. So I was trying to think of really a way of maybe having a public university, even a Zoom university, some open sort of free course where just teaching people the sort of Gramsci basics. but then I never really did it. But I've also then saw that there's people nowadays on TikTok and who do these sort of really good Gramsci light things, and I do think there's value in that. But then the second thing sort of slightly links to this, which is that in terms of economics and the sort of hegemony of that, maybe the one thing we can do when we're not in power yet, but is also just to kind of maybe have a sort of word gorilla thing that we kind of just try to get different words. In fact, some of you were saying this yesterday about just getting degrowth as a word out more, or other words like or change how people think about particular words. That if we, and that is of course what anthropology does anyway, that we kind of look at what we mean by words and we question it. So if we maybe just kind of get that out there as the sort of real basics. So growth, and what is growth, or like kind of just, and to be really simple, but to keep on questioning things. And yeah, that's what I'm sort of thinking, maybe vocabulary.
I'd like, if I may, to just go back to your question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know your name. Anna, where you were asking about the problems of accessing past experience, history. And I think that's a really interesting question, because it fits in with what I think we've already been talking about, which is that anthropology is very good at providing alternatives across sort of space, if you like. But then we also have this problem of alternatives sort of across time. And I think understanding more about how the past is sort of obscured in various ways, but also is sort of actively unremembered in all kinds of ways is interesting. And I wondered if people wanted to jump in on that question. And please do. Sorry, I've sort of slightly co-opted your question, so you should probably restate it.
No, I mean, I just like came up with that question because I watched 3:45 by Ken Loach quite recently, and for me it was a shock to see all the movement that was happening in this country not so long ago, and there is nothing that remembers that. And also, like, sometimes coming from Spain, I mean, my grandfather was an anarchist, so maybe I'm influenced by that. But seeing here the union and you know, some unions, sometimes it's like, why there is no memory of what happened in the past? Because, you know, sometimes like, so thinking, for instance, about UCU, that we are demanding for like a high salary, isn't, I mean, for me, it would be in favor if we fight for like to decrease like the student fees, because it's so expensive. I mean, my salary is okay. I mean, I have to share a room in London, but it's fine. I'm a lecturer, but it's fine. While students really struggle to come here and to survive here, so we should fight for this rather than to increase our salary, because if we want to degrowth in academia, I think that, you know, yeah.
Thank you. Ritu.
Yeah, so I think that I think about, you know, we talked during this workshop a lot about colonialism and decolonialism. And, you know, I think to kind of uncover some of the things that were silenced by colonialism meant going into the archives, you know, and anthropology does research really well. And I think that, you know, we can go into the archives and we can uncover the stuff that's trying, because, you know, also social media is controlled by a few CEO Silicon moguls now, you know, and even print media. So I think we need to uncover those. But also, you know, there's a lot, and here I'm going to talk about the feminist movement. You know, I was in Beijing in '95, and I was at the EU conference a couple of weeks ago, and I felt like I've never felt that kind of energy since '95. You know, that momentum that something's going to change. The personal was the political in '95, but then I've, you know, being part of working on gender issues and feminism, watched it go forward, then go backwards, and go forward and go backwards. And now we're backsliding. When you look at international treaties and, you know, the Rio +20, we've actually lost ground on some of the reproductive rights, you know. So I think recovering that, you know, saying, hey, we've lost ground. And then, you know, you've got also backlash. People working in these activist positions, you know, are sometimes subject to backlash and burnout. All the people that used to work, you know, in feminist movements and don't work there anymore, but have all these histories, you know, but who are really important. So I think we can recover and uncover those voices, bring them back. So I think it's recovery, you know, and I think anthropology is good at giving voice to people who resist. the resistors. And so I think that that's really quite important, is recovering the things that are being silenced over.
Sorry, I think if I can briefly respond to that, or say something about that, would that be okay? And then I will, but I actually want to say almost two contradictory things. One is that I actually agree with you that there's a real sort of presentism, which I think is a real, in our time and in modern, it's part of almost modernity, and it's a real problem, because it's the sort of short-term thinking of the election cycle, but also not being interested in history, and this sort of childish, in fact, I see it in my children, this sort of discourse belief that everything now is good and everyone in the past was, old-fashioned and didn't know things, and that's kind of really weird as well. But I do think that is a problem, and sort of more, and we don't have this sort of long-term thinking of ancestors or descendants, and maybe, Robin Wilkimra writes about this quite a lot, in that there are other different ways of thinking about all this. At the same time, I am also interested, that's sort of my project that I'm really interested in, is to sort of say, actually, it's not all forgotten. And it is so many things, like in this sort of, we have never been modern. They're like, loads of things are here, like in us, and we do know things, and we just don't know we know them. And or people around us know them. Like we might all shop at Asda or something, but next door you have all these different shops which actually have loads of different foods, and we don't. So loads of things are here, and we can tap into that, and maybe just to sort of give people the consciousness or the idea that it's not all forgotten. That kind of would help as well. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I also think, I don't know if it's obvious, but I also think, so anthropology can pull things out that have been somewhat forgotten, but for it to stick, I can't see. I don't think it's anthropologists who should do it or who could do it. Like, they can collaborate with other people, but that's more like something either national education or it's culture. But it's also funny to see how these things evolve in culture. So, for instance, like in France, there's this famous song which is from the Paris Commune. Still, people know the song. The majority of people don't know it was a revolutionary song from 1870, And at the same time, like now, there is a new rebirth of, they call it revolutionary choirs. So people gather together, they have made like a little songbook with the revolutionary songs from all over the world. And that's a way that so it's like a fun event. They sing together the songs, and then the task is also to find out like in what context that song was created. So it's a stickier medium than many complicated stories. And when it gets to complicated, what is also surprising, like I think education, at least for what I have seen, again, France is my fieldwork, so that's the context I know the best, although I'm not French. I think national education fails in teaching well social history. But other institutions, like for instance, trade unions, if you become a member of trade union, they do teach their interpretation of history. That's part of getting your trade union card, right? The problem is the trade unions are getting out of fashion, out of political moment, out of a lot of things, right? The numbers are really decreasing. So there have to be new venues, and they do sometimes come up like these revolutionary choirs, which I think is a very interesting way. And these revolutionary choirs, they also go and sing in public events, and like that, even people who don't sing in those are like, oh, what is this as a format, And I think it's interesting to work with these other formats.
I think that because in the UK, history is not mandatory in high school, so they don't have to learn history. And for me, that's a problem on thinking on memory, right? Because in France it's mandatory, in Spain it's also mandatory. I'm a computer scientist and I had to study history, and I think this is like very relevant.
Yeah, that still depends kind of history is being taught, right?
Absolutely. So I know you've been wanting to ask questions. So we're getting a load of really interesting questions coming in as well from our Zoom audience. So let me take your question, then I'm going to read out two from the Zoom people, and we'll have 3 questions out there for us to engage with.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. Really fascinating. And I thought, Pauline, your point that it's interesting to have kind of three variations on the same theme is valuable. So I wanted to pick up on although there was so much that was shared, there was some tensions, I thought, between the 3 different versions that I thought would be interesting to explore. So I thought, Ieva, I really like your kind of typology, and I thought it contained within it a sort of warning against idealism, both in the colloquial sense of idealistic romantic search for the noble savage who has the answer to all our questions, but also idealism in the philosophical sense, not paying sufficient attention to kind of material conditions for a post-growth world. And I thought in Ritu's presentation, in Pauline's presentation, Ritu, to focus a lot on GDP as a kind of ideological enemy that needs to be defeated. But we didn't have to wait for the invention of GDP for the kind of dangerous capitalism, that rapacious capitalism transforming itself to the earth in all the way that Marx describes in Manifesto, right? It's a relatively recent apparition. We didn't even have to wait for the invention of neoclassical economics. That's also relatively recent. So there is a real question about or that it's kind of intellectually satisfying to show once and for all that neoclassical economics is not the correct compass. There's a question about how much that really does change and how much anthropologists are keeping up with kind of transformations in the hegemonic form that global capitalism takes. If you look closely at what Biden's people are saying and so on, and similarly with the capacity of anthropology to provide a tools for the critique of car culture. I mean, it depends, of course, on the society, but in the UK, it seems to me the problem is not car culture. The problem is the way that UK cities were developed after the Second World War, which goes far beyond what any kind of culture or behavioral preference could change. We're talking about a political economy of space. And furthermore, we're talking about spaces which were produced not by neoliberal capitalism, but they were produced by the spirit of 45. They were produced in this moment that we tend to look back on as things were a little bit better, and yet they're in conflict with these post-growth possibilities. So I guess all this leads me to a question. Is there paradoxically a sense in which, in order for anthropology to contribute more powerfully to these questions about the post-growth world, we have to work out a little bit more honestly our relationship to the post-45 world, to the 30 glorious years, as they call it in France, because anthropology seems to have a kind of contradictory relationship with that vision.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm going to read out a question from Felix Giroux, who says, thanks for the awesome presentation. That's nice. Can you share more about collaborating in a transdisciplinary way? For example, how might you work with engineers or clean tech entrepreneurs while holding on to values and beliefs that are rooted in degrowth and more radical politics? So I thought that was that picks up on another interesting theme, I think, about the relationship between anthropology and other disciplines. There's a question from Catherine Whittle for Pauline primarily. In XR, I've heard people make clear statements about whether something is or is not regenerative, but sometimes their ideas contradict one another. Is part of the challenge for a regenerative anthropology clarifying what regenerative means or what it means to work regeneratively? Okay, do you want to start with that one and then?
Yes. Thank you, Catherine. I should admit I've been a little bit sort of imprecise, or I'm thinking through in this word of using the word regenerative. And I also don't think we need to spend a lot of, well, maybe in XR I can see why in practice environments, or when you've already gone down a certain, then it makes sense to sort of think about definitions. But since I've only just come up with this sort of idea of regenerative anthropology, I thought I don't have to start with tight definitions at this point. If it ever, it might come to that we have to define it. But for me, it is really the idea, well, I can say it is about it's about the idea that you draw on what we already have in anthropology or in existing knowledges, and we kind of, and actually, sorry, I should say the main point, which I forgot, I had a final slide, which was that it's of course, and please, actually, I will say this now very briefly. I am doing all this very much also for, of course, to regenerate anthropology, or for the survival of anthropology itself, which we all know is really under threat, and maybe not in, I don't know, in other parts of the world, but certainly in the UK. and very much certain, like Goldsmith's anthropology. I'm here now, but I don't know how much longer we will exist. So there's some real survival issues for anthropology itself. And so, but I think that's not just kind of, obviously it matters for me if I lose my job, but also it matters in terms of, I do think now is the moment for anthropology, and it would be a real tragedy for anthropology to die now when we really need it. Like, you know, the sort of things of timing that we talked about, the kind of practices that, or things that were there, it wouldn't be good. So I would like to really, that's why I'm really pushing all of this now. And I really think we need to get out there. We need to make anthropology known, also that people come and study it, and so regenerate anthropology itself in a different, in a sort of useful way. That's really what I wanted to. Yeah, thank you actually, Catherine, for that reminder. And I didn't answer your, well, we should maybe you start with answering.
Well, does anyone else want to jump into the regenerative discussion? Anyone got anything else to add on that? Did you want to say something on that? Yeah? Okay, no, you. All right. Okay, why don't we then go to the other question?
And listen.
Yeah.
Transdisciplinary question?
Yeah, transdisciplinarity, yes.
You should.
Ritu, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah. So I think, you know, a lot of times when you're in purely anthropological spaces, you know, there's a culture. There's a discipline, a culture within the discipline, how we talk to one another, how we share research, you know, and it's very particular to anthropology. And that's great because it's rigorous. We, you know, grounded in theory, ethnography, even the way we, you know, conferences are structured and how we advance and so on and so forth. There's a genealogy. Who did you be supervised? Who are you going to supervise? Okay. I mean, it could go on and on. There's like all these things that are very particular to anthropology. Now, when you go into other spaces, other disciplines, this is, they learn and they reproduce them, you know, their discipline in very, very different ways. And so, you know, I kind of ran out of time, but in the paper, I talk a lot about this, that it's unnerving, you know, when you go into spaces that are dominated by economists and you know, it's very quantitative. The lingo, the jargon, it's very different. And so, but the thing is that the power relations are also very different, right? When you go into transdisciplinary spaces, and I've gone into many of them, anthropologists tend to be at the margins of the margin. You know, ethnography and qualitative methods are at the margins of the margins. And we know this in development, right? In international development, that really it's at the margin. So there's at issues. The
margins even of qualitative.
Yeah, yeah. So okay.
No, sorry, no, please carry
on. So that's, you know, where it becomes quite unnerving, and you have to kind of unlearn your methods. But the thing is, you're not sure the other disciplines are going to do that because they're in a privileged position, and you know, you're kind of a minority with very little funding. You know, I mean, if you look at funding between disciplines, it's obvious. And you know, so then so how do you stay in academia and you know, go back and forth? It's like you're almost going in and out of different worlds. It's very jarring, it's very difficult, and it's hard to, I think, maintain an academic career, because then you know, your stuff starts to get diluted. You don't always have time. And I'd like to also say that I actually think the GDP world, the business world, is winning here, because the higher education has turned into a business model. And you know, what I hear is that anthropologists, academics, and professors, they don't have time. So whatever time you had for activism, it's gone. And then when you do expend time, you're penalized for it, right? And then there's a few examples of, like, you know, the Jason Hickles, the David Grabers, who've managed to do both. But earlier in his career, David Graeber was also penalized for doing activism. So it's a risky, precarious, and difficult thing to do.
I mean, your views on multidisciplinarity are interesting, particularly because I think I'm right in saying you trained as an engineer.
I did.
Before this, so you've got a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, it is very, I've learned things as an engineer that I didn't learn as an anthropologist, but I've learned a lot of things that as an anthropologist that are really, really useful. So, you know, and so I have been able to work within an international financial institution. And you talked about GDP. Why am I talking about GDP? Because the entire international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, is predicated on GDP, and it came up at the exact moment when the countries were so-called decolonizing. But they weren't. If you actually look at it, it's not decolonialism. It's just changing the jargon and the lingo, but it's to keep that control over the resources and control over the South, right? And Jason Hickel's done an amazing job at saying that aid is a drop in the bucket compared to how the South actually subsidizes now, not even the historical extraction, now subsidizes growth and whatever in the North. So GDP was just a substitute, for the continuation of those relations of extraction, exploitation. That's why it's so critical for me. But you're right, though. In the paper, I'll talk about neoliberalism. So thank you.
Any thoughts on multidisciplinarity?
Yeah, I just wanted to share this one encounter with a guy from McKinsey. He was responsible for McKinsey in Africa, and I just happened to meet him over a glass of wine. And he's like, "Oh, so you're doing anthropology. We wanted to try something new at McKinsey, so we decided to hire 15 social scientists and see what's new they can propose us in analyzing what's going on. And among those 15, there were 2 anthropologists, and those other guys, that like the sociologists, they produce this interesting analysis, but those anthropologists, pretty much they said whatever we're doing, it makes no sense."
Yeah, that's the
and I found it completely irrelevant. So what do you like? What can you contribute? What do? You're totally irrelevant. And I was looking at him, and I do agree that anthropology can be extremely useful. So if we come back to that example of car culture, it can be useful. And there's so many other ways in this way that can be useful. But there's also an ethical imperative to see how that usefulness can be used or not. And I think it is also for anthropologists to see how to become useful. I'd say when anthropologists produce anthropological knowledge, it's not immediately useful, right? It's a package. It's something that is it's still a very bounded, it's a very like a holistic thing. Everything is complicated. You can't just like pull things out of the context. And if you want to actually make it usable, it's an extra step. I think in the degrowth challenge, that's worth sometimes making that extra step. But we should still be in control on how it's being used, because it's also true. There are also some anthropologists that quit academia and they decide to find other jobs. And on some of those jobs, I also think are ethically problematic. Like, for instance, helping some types of advertising. Anthropologists are great at actually doing perfect market research work, but I found that disturbing to use the tools of anthropology to encourage car culture instead of countering car culture, And I think that's also been the challenge of anthropology. The kind of knowledge it produces, it's extremely powerful, but powerful only when it is made in this usable way. And it's not done automatically, right? So that's on the one hand good because it gives us some power to decide when we want to make it usable, when we don't. But it's tricky.
And who reads it? Who reads anthropological, the journal articles? No, it's your fellow anthropologists, fellow social scientists, the people I worked with within development. They don't read that stuff. They never get to it. But then in order to have a job in anthropology, you need to publish it. So you see, it's like a catch-22, and you're right, you need to make that extra step. But the problem with deconstruction is you're taking and it's powerful, you're taking something apart, you're being critical of it. But for degrowth, post-growth, and well-being alternatives, we need to construct. We need to put it back together. And unfortunately, anthropology doesn't teach us how to construct things. Engineering teaches how to, but not always the best ways. But do you know what I'm saying? It just means that we need to learn how to do anthropology in a different way. And it's messy, and it's not perfect, and it's not pure, and it's going to go against some of the theories, but it's a messy world. And so I think that's the discomfort. And I think that's why a lot of I was trying to think, why aren't anthropologists more engaged in degrowth and post-growth? And, there's many reasons, but it is a messy world and it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable.
If I actually just want to, because of car culture, I was going to say, yes, culture was in fact the wrong word, but I kind of used it as a shorthand. But there's even, you can use, say, car dependency is the better word, because that captures the whole infrastructure and political economy of car use, which is, but there is also, then I think I used it ultimately because there is also love of cars. And we were talking about it earlier in Germany. Just use Germany as an example, it is a, people love cars. I mean, it's like and in other places. So, and it's become it's also culture. So, but yes, I do, but the way we think about culture is, of course, to recognize the political economy and all the different sort of things that go together. And yes, pre-GDP, just a little advert, I work on palm oil and plantations. Plantations are a very good, if you start with plantations, which started actually in the late Middle Ages, and then Madeira and all these models, that's sort of where a certain model started, and I quite like that sort of grounded, sort of colonial capitalist model. I was going to say one last thing was of the professionals. If anyone, sorry, this is a slight.
That's okay. Then we should also get back to
I will actually
1945. Sort of moment as well in that.
Yeah, no, actually, well, okay, but just very briefly, it's like self-advertisement. I have a paper coming out in the Journal of Political Economy on sustainability professionals, which we were interested in the question of why do people who have anthropology and political ecology degrees, how do they end up working for the big consultations, big palm oil plant corporations? And I found it really interesting, because I was at the beginning, I was like, what is this paradigm shift? Like, how can this even happen? But it actually, there's a certain trajectory, and it does make sense. And I don't think of them as in any ways, they make decisions, and it's I will stop now, but
okay.
yeah.
I'm told we've got a few minutes to run on, so I think we can run on for another 10 minutes or so to take account of a lot of the questions that are coming up. I feel like we haven't really done justice to your question yet.
No.
Well,
Well, there's a few more questions online as well I want to get to. So, but I don't know whether anyone would like to talk a bit more.
I think when it comes to degrowth, that post-45 world is a big package to unpack and understand. Keep it short. The 30 glorious years. I think there are many different ways, packed and repacked, and it has like a continuously, you see that it is fundamental. And it's also, I think, generally speaking, anthropology is not really engaged with that, because it's more seen like a part of sociology. It's more seen like the Western world. And even though today we study the Western world, it's the present day Western world more so than the 30 glorious years. Now there are things coming out again, like critiquing more like what exactly is work, what exactly is the socialist dream, how even socialists are bought into the growth, et cetera, et cetera. And for that, I think that bit of history is very important to revisit. And that's why also, for instance, even though Marx is very useful for understanding a lot of things, that's also part that is not sufficiently analyzed, and what things should go further.
Yeah. I mean, I think the multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity discussion is really interesting, because some of what we're talking about is about the problematic relationship anthropology has with other disciplines, which I think is a big part of it. But then another part of it is about the problematic relationship with the public, the wider public, and I think kind of separating out those things is important. We've got quite a few more questions coming in. So I just want to read out a couple more, and then I think we should just make sure, take a final round of questions from the audience, and then I'll just leave it to the panel to pick and choose where to comment. So there's a question here from Utta Eichelkamp, who sends greetings from Germany's post-carbon Ruhr Valley.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of general questions. Is the anthropology of degrowth associated with deindustrialization studies? And if so, how? Is it useful to ask what is the scope of naturalism to transform itself? Also, Utta asks, how important are the unions in birthing a degrowth imaginary? Then there's a question from Lorenzo Velotti, who says, Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so I'm really confused as to who's actually asking questions, but it's a good question. So asking about transdisciplinary research, is this methodology the way forward in enabling the most pragmatic and empowering future of research at this unprecedented time? Do you feel that such transactional and reciprocal methodology that involves such a diversity of stakeholders will enable transformative changes in decision-making, such as the shift towards citizens' assemblies, etc., to address structural change towards degrowth or a de-extractivist world? We should probably put these questions, project them up so people can read them. Okay, then finally, there's someone asking, what's the paper that Ritu Verma's paper refers to? Is it available online? So you've got another reader there. Yeah, maybe project it up in case it's good. And then I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, there's something.
There is.
Okay, so a little bit to come back to the issue of temporalities. But when you were saying, made me think like there's a little bit this short-term thing now that we have now. And one of my questions for all of you is like, how do we navigate this tension between presentism and futurism? Also because I know I read this very interesting article on the dangers of the long-termism thinking when you all only think about future long-term, where the important thing is that the civilization in an homogeneous way survive. No, you don't take care. You don't care about the harms of the small communities, because in the big scale, global, cosmological, future-oriented view, this is insignificant, no, in absolute terms. So how do we navigate these things, like thinking long-term, but without falling into this kind of actually opposite to the anthropological thinking, which is like very grounded, community-based, engaged with communities, small problems and harms and things.
Great. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Maybe I could ask Rita as well about this question of distinguishing between false alternatives and real ones, and how they kind of distinct spectrum, whether that is actually a clear line that you can draw, or whether political strategy sometimes can involve both together.
Sure. Great. Okay, so I think we can just take a few minutes now to invite the panel to comment on any aspects of these questions, issues that you'd like to. Who'd like to go first?
I could maybe go. I managed to jot down a few things, but not all. So I will just respond to two very briefly. Yeah. I think unions, I'm not at all an expert on unions, but I do think they're really interesting focal points. And on the one hand, unions, we were discussing Matt Huber's book on climate change and class war earlier today, and how there is a sort of tradition of being very anti-degrowth in the interest of working class workers, and in a sort of union sense, I suppose. But there is that sort of I recently read Nancy Fraser's Cannibal Capitalism, and I really liked how we've been talking about the sort of welfare capitalism phase of the last sort of 40 or 45 years before, 40 or 50 years before neoliberalism, how that is a certain imaginary and certain world in itself that a lot of us are really rooted in, actually. And I sometimes feel unions have that a little bit. It's sort of born of a particular model, and maybe they are not. So I'm a tiny bit critical, but I'm at the same time, and really want to end with that. I do think I'm very excited about unions I think there's just, we do need to broaden the alliances very, very much, and unions are such an obvious way of doing it. And also the sort of enough is enough, all these sort of things, that clearly applies to all areas of life. And if we recognize this and bring it all together, then sorry, I was looking at you, it wasn't you, but anyway, as if you asked the question, but yeah, it's like as if so I think they're really important to recognize both sides, I suppose. And then on your question on temporality, I think that is true. And as I was answering, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, what kind of, is it maybe great grandparents and great grandchildren? Is that sort of what we should think? I don't know. I mean, that's not really, it's not about that. But I do, yes, long-termism is thinking long-term thinking, it's really annoying actually this long-termism exists, because it's such a total awful aberration. And I'm not, long-term thinking does not mean long-termism, but for anyone who, long-termism is this sort of Elon Musk style, you know, thinking about your billions of Elon Musk children living on Mars, and that sort of thing is not, I'm not interested in that in any way whatsoever. So yes,
okay,
important to make the distinction.
Thank you. Ieva, would you like to
Yes,
go next?
I also want to jump into that question on labor unions, because actually I've done some work in just transition, and just transition is the labor union response to global warming and climate change. And the mainstream one, the one that's formulated by the International Labor Movement, the ITUC, is a very disappointing concept today. And I do think it requires more attention. What is the good news? I do think researchers are paying attention, most notably in environmental labor studies. I think they're doing interesting work. They are trying to bring together this very industrial world that has been born in a historically specific moment in Western Europe, to bring that together with people that live in the global south. They're not even formal workers and experience global warming very differently. And I think, yeah, this field of research, environmental labor studies, is very interesting. Would be nice if more of that trickles in the labor movement. And for that, I also think researchers should do more work, because actually a lot of labor unions haven't yet really formulated their response. They haven't yet really formulated their analysis of what's going on and what should be their stance. It's happening right now. So, and when these moments are, which are rare actually, they are open to inputs. And I think is a very interesting moment. So if you want to follow that, that's a good thing to do. And then I also wanted to know, it was more a question for you about the distinguishing between the false and real alternatives. I would really like to underline the fact that we should pay attention to the more, I do think it's a lot also about the material conditions, right? It's not just about like looking at how they are described or what are the discourses, it's really what's behind those. And I think that's what is often missing. And that's what often makes the whole difference. And that's where anthropologists are well placed, better than the GDP people.
Okay, Ritu, do you want to take a couple of minutes, and then I think we should break for tea, because we've got another session coming up.
Well, I think the theme that there's a lot of questions, it's about temporality, right? So the short-term thinking and the long-term, I think that was one of the questions. And I think there's a couple of things. IPCC report recently, a paper that says that by 2027, we're going to see a 1.5 degree change in temperature. Okay, that's urgent. That's 4 years from now. Yeah. And so on the other hand, which means we need urgent action like yesterday. And on the other hand, you know, coming into this workshop, my main question was, you know, why isn't anthropology doing more? Why aren't we engaging more in degrowth, post-growth, well-being alternatives? And actually the workshop showed me two things, that actually we're doing a lot. There's amazing ethnographic work and amazing thinking going on, but it also illuminated that how long it takes for us to produce a PhD, right? Which I'm not saying we shouldn't, you know, but I'm just saying it takes time to get it out there, to be theoretically grounded, to be systematic. But at the same time, you know, there's an urgency to the issues, right? And so this goes back to the, you know, the sometimes it doesn't have to be perfect, that issue of, you know, being pure systematic, but sometimes, you know, right now we need action, right? And so that the temporality, it's a conundrum, the way we conventionally operate in anthropology and the activists, like these are two different temporalities, right? And we need to think about that a little bit more. And the same temporality comes out, I think, during some of the ethnographic work that's taking place, is while some communities in the South, whether they're in, you know, the majority world or their peripheries within the North, they are living a post-growth kind of livelihoods. right? But they're stuck in a GDP world that forces them to use cash and so on and so forth. And so, you know, it's like that interim. So it's kind of like degrowth is the transition period and post-growth is where we want to get to. But in the interim, we are living in a GDP world, which means there's a lot of compromises to be made and it's not perfect. The false alternatives, you know, so I'll just say the one that really flagged this for me was the World Happiness Report, right? I've worked on gross national happiness for a really long time. And the data that comes for the World Happiness Report is GDP data, actually, right? And we're talking about happiness. And you know, it is, yes, it's about living conditions, you know, material, culture, and so on and so forth, but it's also about well-being, psychological well-being. It's also about environmental well-being and also cultural well-being, you know, so it's all these things together and governance. So it's, you know, these things in equal weight, which I think the well-being alternatives are looking at a more holistic approach. So it was just about looking at this pluriverse of alternatives, and some of them are not metrics also, sometimes they're just they're conceptual moral imperatives. So try to make sense so we know what we're talking about. So that's the project, and it's a rushed project talking about temporality because we need to get the information out there because the conversations are happening now, right? And then I think somebody asked me about what's the paper.
Yes, where can they get the paper?
Yeah, so as I said, this is a paper that I presented at the ASA, and I came with one question to the workshop from this paper, and so it's still being worked on. But again, talking about temporality, you know, I think this, I think I might, with maybe David's guidance, try to publish it more like an essay, because I think we need to get this out pretty quickly. I feel so. I feel urgency in my work, and I feel like I think I need to rethink about where it's going to get published, just because it's a live
blog in the meantime.
Yeah, a 10,000 word blog.
Yeah.
But yeah. So.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our time, and I want everyone to stay around for the next roundtable, which is reimagining transitions out of the growth paradigm. So we're moving forward and continuing our discussion, but I'd just like to thank all three of our panel presenters this afternoon for really fascinating presentations. And I'd also like to thank all of you for such great questions and stimulating insights. So thanks, everybody, and see you again in 15 minutes. Yeah.